My family stole $93,000 from me for a cruise while I was supporting them. But when I reported them to the bank, my lazy brother lost his car, they had to sell the house, and now they're working for the first time in years, paying a debt they'll never forget. I'm 29 years old, work as a creative director in Chicago, and make good money. Like really good money for my age. And I guess that was my big mistake, because my family found out and decided I was basically their personal ATM. What happened a few months ago literally made me rethink my entire life and my relationship with them. And when I say they robbed me, I'm not exaggerating. I mean, they literally committed fraud with my credit card for an amount that's going to leave you speechless. But for you to understand how we got to that point, I need to go back a bit and tell you what my family was like before everything went to hell. I grew up in a Chicago suburb, nothing special, a normal house with 3 bedrooms and a small yard that my dad never mowed properly. There are 4 of us, my parents, my younger brother Connor, who's 25 now, and me. Connor was always the baby of the family, you know, the youngest son who can never do anything wrong, and my parents, especially my mom, treated him like he was made of glass or something. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the one who got good grades, who got a scholarship to college, who graduated with honors and got an amazing job right after finishing my degree. Connor, meanwhile, dropped out of college after 1 year because he didn't like waking up early. No, seriously, that was literally his excuse. And since then, he's been living with my parents doing absolutely nothing productive with his life. I started helping my parents financially like 5 years ago, when I was 24 and had just gotten my first big promotion. My dad worked part-time at a hardware store and my mom didn't work, and they told me they were having problems with the mortgage, that they needed temporary help. Just until things got better. You know how that goes. I started giving them like $2,000 a month, which honestly didn't affect me that much because I was making good money and lived alone in a small but comfortable apartment. I thought I was being a good son, that I was helping my family in a difficult time, and they always told me how grateful they were and that I was their blessing and all that emotional stuff that makes you feel good. But what I didn't realize at the time, or maybe didn't want to realize, is that Connor wasn't looking for work at all. Nothing. Zero. The guy spent all day in his room playing video games, ordering food delivery that my parents paid for with the money I gave them, now, and basically living like he was 15 instead of 20-something. Every time I asked why Connor wasn't working, my mom had a different excuse, that he was depressed, that he was looking but couldn't find anything he liked, that he needed time to find himself. All those phrases that sound nice but basically mean he's lazy and doesn't want to do anything. Years went by and I kept giving them money, because every time I tried to reduce the amount or suggest that Connor get a job, my mom would make me feel guilty with comments like, "We sacrificed everything for you, we paid for your private school when you were a kid, which was like 3 years and wasn't that expensive. We took you on vacation to a campground 2 hours from home, and now when you need us, you turn your back." And my dad, who's always been quieter and kind of a peacemaker, just stood there saying nothing, like validating what my mom was saying. So I kept giving the money because, I don't know, I guess part of me wanted to be the good son and another part just didn't want to deal with the drama. Fast forward to like 4 months ago, a normal Tuesday, like mid-March, I think, I was in an important meeting with a client when my phone started ringing like crazy. I had it on silent, but I could see the notifications. It was like 6 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize, but that had my bank's area code. Obviously, I panicked because when the bank calls you that insistently, it's never to give you good news. So I asked the client for permission to take an emergency call and ran out of the conference room. I called the number, and a guy named Anthony, who worked in the bank's fraud department, answered, and he said, "Mr. Julian, we need to verify an unusual charge on your credit card, a charge for $50,000 to a travel agency." And I was like, "What?" Literally like that, like unable to process the information. I told him I hadn't made any charge like that it was definitely fraud, and he asked me if anyone else had access to my card or my banking information. And that's when something clicked in my head, because I had left my card at my parents' house like 2 weeks ago when I went to visit them and forgot it on the kitchen table, but they returned it to me the next day, or so I thought. I told Anthony I was going to investigate and would call him back, and I literally left the office, told my assistant there was a family emergency and to cancel everything for my day, and went straight to my parents' house. The whole way I was thinking, please don't let it be them. Please let someone have cloned my card or something, because the alternative was too horrible to consider. I got to the house and walked in without knocking. He still had a key, and found my parents and Connor sitting in the living room watching TV like nothing. Like 3 in the afternoon on a normal workday, and none of them were working or doing anything productive. I asked them directly. Someone used my credit card to buy a trip for $50,000, and all 3 of them went quiet, like that uncomfortable silence that tells you everything you need to know. My mom was the first to speak and said, "Oh, Julian, we were going to tell you, we needed a vacation. We've been so stressed, and Connor has never been out of the country, and we found this incredible deal for a Mediterranean cruise with all the amenities, and we thought you'd be happy that we were finally doing something nice as a family." And I just stood there, unable to believe what I was hearing. Like, are you telling me you spent $50,000 of my money without asking me to go on a cruise? Connor, who was sitting there in sweatpants and a video game t-shirt, had the audacity to say, "It's not that big a deal, bro. You make a lot of money. You're not even going to miss those $50,000. And besides, we already paid for the whole trip with tips and excursions and everything. We can't cancel it now." And my dad finally spoke and said something like, "Julian, son, we understand you're upset, but the card only asked for the numbers and expiration date. We didn't think it was that bad. And you've always helped us." And that's when I realized they genuinely didn't see anything wrong with what they'd done. Like I had an obligation to finance their lifestyle just because I had a good job. I left there without saying anything else because I felt like I was going to explode. Literally, my hands were shaking with rage, and I immediately called Anthony from the bank to report the charge as fraud. He told me he was going to start an investigation and that I'd probably have to file a police report because the amount was so high, and I told him yes, to do whatever he had to do, because I hadn't authorized that charge. The next few days were crazy with calls to the bank, the travel agency, even the police. And it turned out that when the bank looked more deeply into my account, they found it wasn't just the $50,000 for the cruise, but there were other unauthorized charges I hadn't noticed because they were smaller and blended in with my normal expenses. In total, my family had spent $93,000 on my credit card over the last 6 months. $93,000. Not just the cruise, but also expensive clothes, electronics, a new laptop for Connor, furniture for the house, meals at expensive restaurants, literally everything. Anthony showed me the statements and I couldn't believe it. Like every week there were charges I didn't recognize but had ignored because I thought maybe I'd made them and forgotten, or they were recurring subscription charges or something. Turns out my mom had a photo of my card on her phone and had been using it for online purchases constantly, and from time to time Connor also used it for his stuff. When I confronted my family with all the evidence, because the bank gave me a complete report of every fraudulent charge with exact dates and locations, my mom started crying and saying they never intended to steal from me, that they were just going through a difficult time financially and needed things, and that I had so much money they didn't think I'd care. Connor, the cynical bastard, said it technically wasn't theft because we were family and family helps each other, and that I was overreacting by making such a big drama. My dad looked uncomfortable but didn't defend me or say what they'd done was wrong either. He just sat there looking miserable but not doing anything useful. That's when something broke inside me, like that moment when you realize the people who are supposed to love you really just see you as an ATM. I told them I was going to report everything as fraud, that the bank was going to reverse the charges and they were going to have to pay back every penny, with interest and probably legal fees too. My mom started begging me not to do that I was going to ruin them. How could I do that to my own family? And I told her, "You did it to me first. I never would have done something like this to you." The next thing I did, and I'm still not sure if it was out of revenge or necessity or a mix of both, was cut off all the financial support I'd been giving them for 5 years. I sent them a text message to the family group chat. We had ironic, right? Telling them that from that moment on, I wasn't going to give them another cent, that they had to learn to support themselves, and that Connor needed to get a job like any normal 5-year-old bast. Adult. My mom called me like 15 times, crying. Connor sent me messages insulting me and calling me a selfish son of a bitch, and my dad sent me a very short message saying he was disappointed in me for abandoning the family. The weeks that followed were like a mix of freedom and guilt, because on one hand I felt good about finally setting boundaries and not letting them exploit me anymore. But on the other hand, my mom sent me messages every day telling me how they were suffering without my help, how they were going to lose the house, how Connor was depressed because he didn't have money for his things. But I stayed firm because I knew that if I gave in even a little bit, they were going to take advantage of me again. The bank eventually reversed all the fraudulent charges after their investigation, and the complete debt of $93,000 fell on my family because they had made the purchases and signed the cruise contracts and everything. The travel agency sued my parents because they obviously couldn't pay that money, and they started getting calls from debt collectors all the time, like those annoying calls you get 5 times a day that don't stop until you pay. I moved to a new apartment downtown Chicago, farther from where my parents lived, and basically started a new life where they weren't constantly asking me for money or making me feel guilty. The first few months were weird because I was used to being in contact with them all the time, but it was also liberating, like realizing I didn't have to be carrying the financial responsibility of 4 adults when I was only 29 years old. Through Christina, my cousin who's always been the family gossip but in a good way because she keeps you informed, I found out what was happening with them. The debt collectors wouldn't stop calling, literally all day every day, and they eventually took Connor to court because most of the debt was in his name, since he'd signed the cruise contract as the primary passenger. Connor had to get a job for the first time in his life. He started at a diner, flipping burgers, and Christina told me he hated every second, complained constantly that the work was too hard, and his feet hurt from standing so much, things any normal person who's worked knows are just part of life. But Connor being Connor, he quit after 2 weeks, because, according to him, his boss was too demanding, and the customers were rude. Basically, he couldn't handle even the most basic job that exists. My parents, meanwhile, were falling behind on the mortgage, because without my $2,000 monthly dollars, they couldn't cover all their expenses, and my dad had to get a second part-time job at a gas station at night, something my mom blamed me for saying I was responsible for my dad working late at his age. About 2 months after I cut contact, my parents showed up at my new apartment. You don't know how they got my address. Probably Christina gave it to them, and knocked on the door on a Saturday morning. I let them in because, well, they were still my parents, even though I was angry with them. And they looked like haggard and tired, especially my dad, who you could tell had aged like 5 years and 2 months. They sat in my living room and my mom immediately started crying, saying they were going to lose the house, that the bank had given them an ultimatum, that they needed my help one last time to catch up with the payments. I told them no, that wasn't my responsibility, that they had created this problem when they decided to steal $93,000 from me, and that they had to find a solution themselves. My dad looked at me with those sad puppy dog eyes and said, "Julian, please, we're your family. We can't end up on the street." And I felt like a bit of guilt in that moment. But I reminded myself that they hadn't had any remorse when they stole all that money from me. I told them they could sell the house and move to a cheaper apartment, get full-time jobs, and basically live within their means like most people do. They left without saying much more, and like a month later, Christina told me they'd indeed had to sell the house. They sold it for less than it was worth because they needed the money quickly, and moved to a small 2-bedroom apartment in a not very nice area of the city, the kind of place with old carpets and thin walls where you can hear the neighbors all the time. Connor had to share a room with my parents because there wasn't space for him to have his own room, and apparently that put him in a very bad mood. But honestly, I didn't care at all. The legal drama continued because the debt collectors eventually took Connor to court, and the judge determined he owed the full $93,000 plus court costs and interest that had accumulated. You know how the system is. They charge you for breathing, basically. Connor obviously had no way to pay that, so the judge ordered wage garnishment, which meant any job he got, they were automatically going to take a large portion of his paycheck to pay the debt. Out of necessity more than desire, Connor finally got a job at a warehouse, like those jobs where you have to load boxes all day and use one of those guns to scan barcodes. Nothing glamorous, but it was honest work and paid like $15 an hour. Christina told me the first few months, Connor complained all the time on Facebook, made dramatic posts about how hard his life was and how the system was against him. And I couldn't help but laugh a little because welcome to the real world, brother. We all work. The best part, or worse depending on how you see it, was when they repossessed his car. Connor had a 2018 Honda Civic that my parents had bought him when he was 2, one probably with my money now that I think about it. And since he couldn't make the payments because his wages were being garnished, the bank people went and took it literally from his work parking lot. Christina sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post where Connor was like having an emotional breakdown, saying his life was a disaster and he didn't understand how he'd gotten to that point. And again, I know it sounds cruel, but I felt a weird satisfaction reading that because he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. My mom kept trying to contact me for months, sending me long messages about how I was destroying the family, how Connor was suffering because of me, how my dad was working 2 jobs and barely sleeping, and every message was like an attempt at emotional manipulation to make me feel sorry and go back to giving them money. But I'd already made the decision not to give in, and every time I read her messages, I just reminded myself of all the money they'd stolen from me, all the lies they'd told me, and how they'd never really apologized, just justified themselves saying I had money to spare. Now it's been like 4 months since I cut off financial contact, and according to Christina, things have stabilized a bit, but not much. Connor's still working at the warehouse, hating it with every fiber of his being, but with no other options because no one else is going to hire him without experience and with his track record. They're going to be garnishing his wages for years, probably until he's like 35 or older depending on how much he earns. And he lives in that small apartment with my parents, with no privacy or space for his things. My dad's still working his 2 jobs, and my mom finally got a part-time job at a store because they needed the money and could no longer afford for her to stay home doing nothing. Do I feel guilty? Sometimes yes, honestly. There are nights when I think about my dad working late at the gas station, and I feel bad because he really wasn't the main villain in all this. He was more like a passive guy who let my mom and Connor do whatever they wanted without intervening. But then I remind myself he had multiple opportunities to say something, to defend me, to tell my mom what they were doing was wrong, and he never did. He chose the easy path of staying quiet, and now he's paying the consequences of that decision, along with the rest of them. Do I feel vindictive? Also sometimes. I'm not going to lie and say I didn't feel a certain satisfaction when I found out they'd taken Connor's car, or when I learned they had to sell the house and move to a much worse place. Part of me, the part that was being exploited for 5 years, feels like there's finally justice, that they're finally experiencing even a fraction of the stress and frustration I felt when I discovered they'd stolen almost $100,000 from me. What I do know is I'm not going back to helping them financially, at least not in the near future, or maybe never. I've learned there are people, even family, who see your generosity as a weakness they can exploit, and that boundaries are necessary even if they make you feel like the bad guy in the story. My mom called me 2 weeks ago, the first time in like a month, and her tone was different, less demanding and more like defeated, and she asked if we could talk someday, that she wanted to really apologize. I told her maybe, that I needed more time, and she said she understood. I don't know if I'm going to accept their apologies or if I'm going to forgive them someday. Honestly, I haven't gotten to that point yet. What I do know is, my life has improved since I set those boundaries, since I stopped carrying the responsibility of supporting 3 adults who could perfectly well support themselves if they really wanted to. I'm sleeping better. I'm saving more money for myself. And for the first time in years, I don't have that constant weight on my chest of knowing my family is depending on me to survive. Connor will probably hate me for the rest of his life. And honestly, I'm okay with that. We were never super close anyway. And now that I see how he really is, how he reacted when he finally had to work and be responsible, I don't think he's the kind of person I want to have a relationship with anyway. My dad and I might be able to rebuild something eventually, but it's going to take time, and it's going to require him to acknowledge his part in all this, to admit he stayed quiet when he should have spoken up. And my mom, well, that relationship is more damaged than the others because she was the one who manipulated me the most, who made me feel the most guilty, who clearly favored Connor over me and used my sense of family responsibility against me. If we're ever going to have a healthy relationship, she's going to have to fundamentally change the way she sees and treats me, and I'm not sure she's capable of making that change at her age. For now, I'm living my life, focusing on my career, which is going incredibly well. He just got another promotion last week. Going out with friends, meeting new people who don't have expectations about my money, and basically being a normal 29-year-old person instead of being the financial father of my family. It's weird, but it's also liberating, and although there are moments of guilt and doubt, most of the time, I know I made the right decision. I learned the hard way that sometimes family can be toxic, that love doesn't mean you have to let yourself be exploited, and that it's okay to say no even if they make you feel like the villain. I guess that's my story. And if Connor or my mom read it someday, well, they already know my version of events.